So you should see my screen now. You'll see a Tennyson Curbside Access Plan PDF.
Great.
All right, wonderful. So yeah, thank you, Naomi, and thank you, District 1, for providing us with the opportunity to present today on the parking plan that we've been working on with stakeholders from the neighborhood since July of 2020. So we've got a draft that we wanted to share, and then we recently mailed a letter that hopefully most of you received that summarized these changes and how we got here, and then asked for your feedback as well. And as Naomi mentioned, this will be a relatively quick presentation with the idea that we really want to focus on comments and questions for you all. So saving most of the time to hear from folks in the folks that are attending the meeting. So with that, I will dive right in to the presentation. So again, I'm Scott Burton. I'm with the Curbside and Parking, and we're part of Transportation Operations, which is part of the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, formerly known as Public Works. And more specifically, in case you're curious, Curbside and Parking consists of our on-street programs group, Curbside Planning, that's the group that I am in, and then meter operations, and then off-street parking as well. So we manage car share, valet parking, the residential parking permit program, and then I'm more specifically involved in our parking and curbside planning efforts, policy efforts as well. And then I support our transportation design and transportation planning groups. And then, so I'll kick it off by just talking a little bit about what are curbside access plans. So so this is a relatively new term. We used to call them parking area management plans. And now we are referring to them as curbside access plans, but the process is the same. It's just a different name to emphasize that this process is about things beyond just parking, that it's more about the curbside and not just parking vehicles and that kind of thing. And so what are curbside access plans? So essentially they are basically comprehensive parking plans that are developed for a particular neighborhood or a portion of a neighborhood. They're typically implemented within 9 months. That depends on city resources and how often the committee can meet and how large the study area is as well, and what the recommendations look like. But I think we can implement this plan pretty quickly. They are designed to address an area's changing conditions. So they're designed to address areas, neighborhoods in the city that are changing, that are becoming more dense, where redevelopment is taking place, or maybe areas that are being rezoned. Areas that have parking strategies and restrictions in place that maybe don't address all the activity that is taking place in the neighborhood. And then they are very customized and collaborative. And by that, I mean that each area management plan or curbside access plan that we implement is very unique and different. We have a different type of restriction. It's really tailored toward what the neighborhood would like and what they think would address the parking challenges that they are experiencing. So it's very customized and it's collaborative in the sense that we work very closely with a committee of roughly 10 individuals that represent the RNO, council office, and merchants associations. And we work with them to develop the draft. And in case you're curious, areas are selected. These are the primary criteria that we look at when determining where we should be developing one of these curbside access plans. So we look a lot at stakeholder interest and development activity, and where are increasing densities taking place? What areas are we developing? I think I mentioned earlier zoning changes, and parking inconsistencies is a big thing as well. So for example, in this study area for this plan, we have a combination of 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. time limits, and then 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. And then there are several blocks in there that don't have restrictions at all that probably should. And so we have some inconsistencies and the desire to fill in some gaps as well. And we also try to coordinate that with our sign suite program, and city council input is certainly a big factor as well when identifying areas to work in next. And then also opportunities to partner with other city projects and initiatives, and then frequency of resident and business inquiries. So we receive hundreds of requests for permits and time limits and loading zones per year. And so whenever we're getting quite a bit of those from the same area, that's sort of a red flag to us that we need to spend more time and that we need to spend time developing a comprehensive parking plan for this neighborhood. And then in terms of a timeline, this graphic probably needs to be updated. We just haven't gotten around to doing that yet, but it represents what the typical process looks like, although we found several opportunities in the last couple of years to streamline that. But in general, we meet with our committee that we assemble to help us develop the draft. We meet with them to identify parking challenges, generators, where are people going, what's driving the demand in the neighborhood. So we talk a lot about that, and then user groups, who's coming to the neighborhood, who's parking on the street, who's trying to access these businesses. And then we talk more about goals. So given the parking challenges that people are experiencing, what are some of the goals? What do we want to get out of this? And that's sort of the second meeting. And then the third meeting really focuses on either developing a draft plan or reviewing one that I put together in advance that the committee then reacts to. And we really putting pen to paper and really figuring out, so if we identified loading as a challenge, where should that loading be? Or where's short-term parking needed? And then after that, we mail a draft of the plan to all impacted addresses within the study area, and then we incorporate their feedback and address their feedback. And then we mail a second letter that says, hey, thanks for your feedback. Given all of those comments, here are the changes that we made to the plan. Attached is the final draft, and implementation is scheduled for April, for example. And one thing that we've realized is that meeting via Zoom and Microsoft Teams and other virtual platforms really given us the ability to meet more frequently. Typically, meetings in the past were held on a monthly basis, but we're able to meet more frequently. So I think in the future, we'll be able to get these done faster, but I still think that we can implement this management plan at some point this spring or early summer. And then why are area management plans? See, here I go using the old term again. Why are curbside access plans needed? So these are four of the main themes in terms of why we need these plans and why we need to put these in place. So we need something that's accommodating, something that considers the needs of all users, when it considers the needs of residents, patrons, employees, and then certainly accommodating in the sense that these challenges should be addressed comprehensively. So it's not just one block contacts the city about making a parking time limit and permit change, but that we address everything all at once and that we're more comprehensive in our approach. And then in curbside and parking, we talk a lot about highest and best use. And what we mean by that is there are a lot of demands for the curb, whether it be for bike corrals, for loading zones, short-term parking, traditional time limits. But we want to try to determine what's the highest and best use, what's the most efficient use of our resources, given all of the different curbside demands throughout the city, that with the prevalence of bike lanes and transit lanes through the city now, just really thinking about what makes the most sense and how can we use our resources efficiently, given all these shifting curbside priorities and transportation technologies and whatnot. And then we want something that's replicable, something that's consistent throughout that neighborhood, but that's also transparent so that residents have an opportunity to weigh in, to provide their perspective, to tell us what their challenges are and what they think would work best. Something that's flexible and equitable. So a replicable process is a big piece of this as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, changing city is a big piece of this. We focus these on areas that have been rezoned, that are in transit-oriented development areas. Changing city, we have mobility goals and shifting transportation priorities. And so how can we develop a plan that can react to some of that as well? And then increasing densities is a big challenge and something that we try to address as well. And so expected outcomes, touched on some of this earlier, but really just restrictions, parking restrictions that address current levels of activities, ones that have been done comprehensively, strategies that correspond with changing land uses. So for example, you might have short-term parking near a post office that is no longer there, or near a coffee shop that has redeveloped into something else with a more evening-oriented use. So what's in place today along Tennyson, what can change? So looking at those opportunities, and then just comprehensive strategy that addresses all of these concerns at once. At least that's the goal. and then flexible as well. So once we go in and we put, let's say, restrictions on a block, and let's say we implement 2-hour time limits on a block that doesn't currently have 2-hour time limits, once we have that infrastructure in place, once we have those sign poles in place, if there's adjustments that need to be made in the future, that's relatively easy once we have the infrastructure. So flexible management and restrictions, with the idea that once we've implemented one of these curbside access plans, that we are committed to making sure that it continues to work well. So we work with our committee in the future and with the residents in the neighborhood to make sure that as the neighborhood continues to change, that we are updating our plan, that we are, for example, if there's a block that doesn't meet our threshold for time limits today, but it does 6 months from now, making sure that we can go in and put those restrictions in place quickly so that this plan continues to work well in the future, so that we don't want the neighborhood to have to wait another 10 years for relatively easy changes. So a commitment from the city to continue to make this neighborhood a priority in the future. And then expected outcome is just a strategy that really maximizes our assets and our resources and looks for opportunities to integrate transportation options. For example, the bike corrals that were recently installed on Tennyson last summer. And in case you're curious, some of the curbside access plans that have been developed in the past, I failed to mention earlier that the first plan was implemented in 2015 in the Baker Broadway Spear area. And then since then, we've worked in West Highlands, had a very unique strategy that we put in place in Platt Park along the Pearl Street corridor. We've worked extensively in the Five Points neighborhood in Curtis Park. Most recently, we implemented plans in Lincoln Park, in Baker, and in Cherry Creek North, and then we've worked quite a bit in Capitol Hill as well. Currently, we have a Rhino plan in progress that's sort of the Rhino portion of 5 Points in the Cole neighborhood, and then Berkeley Park, Tennyson corridor, and then 2021 priorities are still being determined, with the idea that we will implement this plan and then continue to work on Rhino and Cole as well. And then with that, I can jump in to talk more specifically about the plan that we're working on currently, the Tennyson Curbside Access Plan. So a little bit about project timeline and milestones. So I mentioned earlier that we started working with our committee in July. We held meetings in July, August, and September. And then in October, I provided a brief overview of the plan at a Berkeley Regis United Neighbors meeting, and then a Tennyson Berkeley Business Association meeting in October, and then revised the draft based on feedback received at those two meetings. And then our feedback letter was mailed in probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Hopefully many of you received that. And if you have, please submit feedback to that email address that's on that letter by February 8th, and happy to take comments and questions here shortly as well. So what was discussed at the committee meeting? So I mentioned that one of the first committee meetings really talks a lot about challenges. So talking about parking challenges, hopefully none of these are really surprises to you all that live in the neighborhood, but construction vehicle parking and construction activity was mentioned as a challenge and something that's pretty impactful. And then increasing residential density, especially north of 44th Avenue. And then just inconsistent time limits. As I mentioned earlier, there's a combination today of 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. And so how can we address that? And then a lack of short-term parking in the correct locations, and then the need for more disability parking. And then inadequate turnover in the evening. So by that, I mean that basically the time limits that exist today perhaps don't extend in the evening enough. So 6 p.m. is too early. So we also talked a lot about user groups. Who is coming to the neighborhood? Who's parking here? What are the generators? So from a user group perspective, obviously we have residents and employees. We have students, congregates, construction workers, and patrons and park users. And then generators, we talked quite a bit about that too. And I think, Sprouts and Natural Grocers, and then there's a high school, and then a couple places of worship and meditation that generate quite a bit of demand as well. And then the Oriental Theater. And then just in general, we all know that Tennyson is a vibrant, active, destination for many people. So there's businesses along that corridor that attract people throughout the city. And so based on that user group challenges and generators discussion, we came up with some goals. And and appropriate time limits being one of those, and parking flexibility for residents and guests, and patrons and employees as well. And then longer term parking options, with the idea that the 2 hour might not be the most appropriate all the time, but still works for the most part, but perhaps we need to look at something that goes later into the evening. And then looking at strategic locations for short-term parking and disability parking. So with that, let's see, I'm going to pull up a different document real quick so that you all can see this draft in more detail. So can you all see a draft of this plan, hopefully? And so what I'll do is just kind of walk you through some of the changes that we're proposing. So one of the most significant things, in my opinion, at least, is the introduction of what we call an area permit, which is this area shown in blue. So area permits were first introduced in the Baker neighborhood about 6 years ago. And basically they allow permitted residents that live within this area to park on any block within the blue area. So if you get home in the evening, and let's say you live on Raleigh or on Stewart, which only has parking on one side of the street, and you get home late at night, and a lot of people are, visiting the restaurants and whatnot along Tennyson, that this will provide you with an opportunity to park on any block within that area. Today, we have most of the, or all of the block faces are what we call block rule permits, which requires you to only park on your block. So the implementation of the area permit will just allow residents and their guests with more flexibility to park on additional blocks within the study area, with the exception of Tennyson. Obviously, we want to make sure that only patrons and can park on that corridor, prioritizing that for them. Another significant change is the introduction of 3-hour parking on the avenues. This came out of a committee conversation with the idea that if you come to the corridor, if you come to Tennyson and you want what was referred to as the slow speed experience, if you want to stay for a little bit longer, if you want to grab a drink and then dinner and then grab ice cream and then do some shopping, you might want to stay for more than 2 hours. And so looking at opportunities to put in some 3-hour parking to provide people with the option to stay longer, or with the option to not have to move their vehicle. And then another recommendation was extending the time limit to, we talked a lot about that. We talked a lot about the fact that today we have 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., 2-hour time limits, and what makes the most sense in the future. And does 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. make sense, or does something that ends a little earlier, is that more appropriate and would still be accommodating and encourage turnover into the evening, but not be too difficult to where it's impacting residents' way of life? What we've seen is if we're too aggressive with our time limit, let's say 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. or 8 a.m. to midnight, it makes it real difficult for residents to entertain in the evenings, to have guests over, right? Because they do have a guest permit, but they only get one. And so if the time limit goes to 10 p.m., it can make entertaining difficult. And so we don't want to make things too restrictive. And so we thought that 8 p.m. would be a good place to start the discussion, at least. And then here highlighted in white and blue, those are the blocks that do not have time limits today. So the white and blue ones, we are proposing as of now to introduce 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. time limits. And so that's mainly on these portions of Utica and Stewart, and then Tennyson north of 44th as well. And then in the same vein here, we have where we're proposing to put 3-hour time limits on the avenues. So right now, the discussion was focused on trying to develop a pattern for the 2 and 3-hour parking, so that if you're looking for the 3-hour, you know that you're going to find that on the avenues, and that you're going to find 2-hour parking on the streets. And so we identified the avenues as being the more appropriate place for the unrestricted parking that will remain in certain places, this tan color, for example, and then the green parking, with the idea that residential frontage is more limited on the avenues, and so it wouldn't be as impactful to residents if it was placed on the avenues, and then just creating a predictable pattern so that they know where to go when looking for that 2 and 3 for that 3-hour parking. We also are proposing to introduce some strategic short-term parking, so some 30-minute parking at Tennyson here between 38th and 39th, and then again here at 41st, and any additional locations that come up. Here's another one at a coffee shop north of 44th Avenue. And then we're working to identify additional disability parking locations as well. Today, the only one that exists in this area is here on 41st. And so where do other disability parking needs exist? And that's something that we're going to continue to improve. So expect the final draft to have some additional locations identified. And then with that, I think those are really most of the highlights. It's really the introduction of the 3-hour parking, the modification of the 2-hour time limit, the introduction of the area permit versus the traditional block rule permits that exist today. See if there's anything else I'd like to point out. And then, yeah, I guess just to be clear on the time limits, so they would be effective Monday through Saturday. So Sundays and holidays would continue to be accepted, which is pretty common throughout the city. And with that, I think, Naomi, I'm ready for questions or comments. I've got my pen ready to take notes and yeah, turn it over to the audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. We've got a couple of questions coming in. I'm just going to start in the order that they came. So first we have a question from Leslie. How do people get this info, especially if you don't belong to an RNO, to check out these drafts or get notified of updates and changes?
Here's a great question. So if you live anywhere within this study area, you should have received a letter in the mail about 2 or 3 weeks ago. If you have not, for some reason, please email parking.operations@denvergov.org. And that email address is on the letter. That's the address that we use for intake for comments and questions related to this plan. And I respond to all of those. So if you didn't get that, email that address and we can continue to keep you in the loop and make sure that your address is in our database so that when we do our second mailing with the final draft, you receive it.
Great. And if people don't necessarily live directly in those mailing areas, but still want to weigh in, should they email that as well?
Yep, that'd be fine. Yep, that address works for that as well.
Okay, fabulous.
So yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
As I say, we talk a lot about that. Do we only, send letters to the addresses that are being directly impacted, i.e. we're proposing time limits on their block today. And so we buffered a little bit by, a block roughly in every direction to make sure that those people are at least aware of the changes that are taking place nearby.
Definitely. And I went ahead and I put that email address into our Zoom chat. I'll put it onto Facebook as well.
Oh, wonderful.
parking.operations@denvergov.org.
That's it. Thank you.
So question from Alan. Is there any plan to add an additional on-street bike corral near 44th and Tennyson?
That's a good question, and we can certainly look at it. I do know that the bike corrals that were put in place in the summer have been pretty popular. I did a lot of data collection in August and September, and even with COVID taking place and just activity being down, those bike corrals seem to be pretty popular. So we can certainly look at one. Alan, if you have a specific location, feel free to email that address, but we can certainly in general just look at that intersection, that location, to see if we can identify one. I know we have several that still need to be implemented this year, and we're still looking for locations. So appreciate the suggestion.
Great. I have a question. It's kind of a bigger question too, but about just trends in parking access and curbside management in terms of, especially during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of carry out, and of course, I know that there's loading zones and passenger loading only zones here. Maybe you could just talk super briefly about what kind of trends are we seeing for delivery, pickup, Lyft and Uber kind of things that affect smaller commercial areas like this.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. A year ago, we were talking so much about how Uber and Lyft is continuing to become more and more prevalent, and we need to be developing loading zones that are more Uber and Lyft specific and go beyond just traditional passenger loading, that something needs to reference Uber and Lyft or ride app pick up and drop off only. So that was our priority a year ago. Then COVID hit, and we have not hardly talked about that at all since. And the priority has really been on what can we do to make sure that businesses, survive these difficult times, to make sure that their pickup and their drop off, their delivery drivers have places to park nearby, and that folks picking up food have convenient locations to park. And so we've done a lot around that throughout the summer, throughout the city, and throughout the fall. To what we've been doing is we've either been converting, let's say there's a loading zone near your business that is 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. We've been changing that to all times so that it can be used in the evening by people to pick up food, or by delivery drivers that just want to pop in there really quick, pick their food up, and then leave. And then we've been doing a lot of 5-minute loading or parking signs throughout the city as well, to just try to make that process easier. And we haven't really talked a lot about that for this corridor. For the most part, discussions around loading in regards to this plan is that the loading zones were working fairly well, that they were placed at a nice distance throughout the corridor, and that loading was not really much of an issue and was working well. But if there are certain restaurants or businesses along Tennyson or the adjacent avenues that would like some kind of short-term parking, email that address as well. We're making those short-term spaces that we're putting in place a priority. We can generally install those within a couple weeks. So those take priority. As soon as those requests come in and we approve, let's say a short-term 5-minute loading spot, we get that in as quick as we can, because we know how important it is to businesses.
Yeah, definitely. Just to follow up on that a little bit before I jump to a question from Jill, as you mentioned, and right now we're in a very unique, hopefully soon to be over, at least this year, kind of phase that's put these certain type of pressures on the streets and on businesses. And it's interesting seeing this plan, and how you've described having to react to that, which kind of brings up the question for me: how nimble are these access plans? When are they revisited? As conditions change, is there a trigger? Is it going to be reevaluated in 2 years, or is there some other trigger that'll come in and say, hey, like, we actually need something different now, or let's see how this is doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so that was what made this one more challenging than some of the other plans that we've developed, mainly because we didn't know the parking occupancy data. So we rely a lot on parking occupancy data to know where people are parking and when they're parking there. And we really look at like 5 a.m., noon, and 7 p.m., say on a Friday, to know what those parking patterns look like throughout the day. But we know that that data that we have is from 2017. So that's 4 years ago. And anybody that lives in the neighborhood knows that a lot of changes have taken place in this neighborhood, and especially along this corridor in the last 4 years. And so that data really wasn't as valuable as we were hoping it would be. So I conducted lots of parking observations, and we collected a lot of data throughout the summer to try to help us identify which blocks would time limits be appropriate on. So for example, we've received some requests recently about Raleigh and about Vrain, and that, when you make changes to Utica and Stewart, that's going to push people onto Raleigh. So maybe today, Raleigh is, let's say, 40% occupied, but all of a sudden we put 2-hour time limits on Stewart, and Raleigh is 80% occupied in the future. And so as soon as we implement this plan, we will be conducting parking observations and collecting data pretty routinely for about 6 months to identify where we're pushing vehicles to. So given the plan that we implemented, what areas are now being impacted that weren't beforehand, and where do we need to put 2-hour time limits in? So we act pretty quickly to take care of that. So we do know that this plan will change patterns, and we'll document where those parking patterns are and make sure that we're addressing that as quick as we can.
Great. And if people want to give comment on how well it's working or challenges going forward after it's implemented, is that, can they contact you with that email address?
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, so we've implemented 12 or 13 of these, and I probably respond to at least a couple or a few emails a week for plans that we developed and implemented, 3 or 4 years ago, because we had residents that we work closely with that had great feedback. And once we have those assets, we have those people that we can rely on for such great information. And so once we get feedback from them, we'll take a look at it. So if we get an email that says, man, this plan is great, but my block of Raleigh is just, man, it was nice and quiet beforehand, but now it's parked full on Thursday and Friday evenings, especially, I think we need 2-hour time limits. We'll go out, we'll take a look, and then we'll do outreach just to that block. So if we're going to make an adjustment to, let's say, the 40, 200 and 300 blocks of Raleigh, for example, we would just contact the folks that live on that block and do outreach around that. But we could put those time limits in place pretty quickly. But yeah, people can always email parking.operations for any parking related comments, questions, suggestions. And that applies to not just this neighborhood, but anything throughout the city.
Nice. That's good to know. And of course, you can always, if you do contact us at district1@denvergov.org, we can send you to the right place as well. But it's great to know that what we would do is probably just go straight there and contact Scott, send you to operations.
That sounds great.
It's awesome to have that direct contact info. So another question I have is, with these increased kind of restrictions, what does enforcement look like differently? How, I assume will be more staff who have to come through and look at enforcement like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like to mention that in our letter, but I was running out of room, and I wanted to keep our letter to one page, and I didn't have room to put in a piece about enforcement. So I'm glad you mentioned that. But yeah, so what comes with this plan is not only a commitment from the city that we're going to make sure that this plan continues to work well in the future, that it's flexible and we update it as things change, but also a commitment that it will be enforced. And so it's an enforcement commitment that they can enforce the 2 and the 3 hour time limits. The 3 hour time limits we thought would be challenging about 4 years ago when we introduced those in the West Highlands neighborhood. So along 32nd and Lowell, that's what you'll find on the street. So not 32nd, but Osceola, Perry, and whatnot. And that was the first time we've done 3 hour parking. This will be the second. And so yeah, it's a commitment that it can be enforced, that it will be enforced. And then if you don't feel like it is, you can contact me and I can chat with our enforcement colleagues to make sure that we can address those concerns as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question in the chat from Rob. And I think this is a good question. This is a very kind of large philosophical question too about right-of-way. And public right-of-way is what we call the streets and the sidewalks, things that are not private property. So Rob brings up that many of the residences in this area, if not most, have private garages and alleyways. So they do have off-street parking. And whereas the streets are public right-of-way, and as convenient as it is to be able to park in front of your house, it is not a right. That's public area. And he wonders what is being done to educate people or just kind of have that conversation about that the street in front of your house isn't your private parking spot. And I know this can be a little contentious, and these can be hard conversations sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good question, good comment. So separate from this effort here, this Tennyson Curbside Access Plan, we have a citywide effort underway to basically develop what we call rules and regulations for our parking permit program. And that's really just a government term for parking permit policy. And so part of that is going to be, developing a parking permit program that is more transparent and more flexible and more consistent. The policy that we have in place today is doesn't address a lot of the changes that have taken place in the city. So we just need to update that. And part of that conversation is around the right of way and what it's used for and how to prioritize it and how do you determine the highest and best use and how do you encourage people to use their garages and encourage them to understand that the right of way doesn't belong to them, that they shouldn't always have the expectation that they can park in front of their home, especially if they live in a vibrant, active, popular area like Tennyson. And so there's a lot of conversations taking place around education and what the right of way is for and how it's just so much different. I've been at the city for almost 6 years now. And when I got here, we were talking about, parking, everything was parking. And then we started using the term curbside more. And now it's the curbside is also transit lanes and bike lanes, and there's so much demand for it. And so encouraging people to, park off street when they can is certainly something that we try to emphasize as well. And so if you're curious about the parking permit rules and regulations or the policy effort that's underway, there's going to be some outreach around that in the spring. So if you're curious and you want more information, you can email that parking.operations address as well, and I can give you an update and put you on a list so that you can stay in the loop on that as it moves forward.
We'll definitely be posting about that in our newsletter as well. We're excited for that. And there's some District 1 representatives who will be sitting on there, and it's going to be a big citywide conversation. Leslie had a question that segues well. So I think it's also a great shout out that bike and scooter share are coming. Bike share is coming back. Scooter share is coming to Denver. And I'm hoping you could maybe just do a little shout out to that, and then how will this plan adapt to allow for maybe potential bike share or scooter share, like actual city share corral placement?
Sure, that's a good question. I think that's one of the unfortunate things of working remotely is I don't have conversations with colleagues that are closer to those bike share and scooter share conversations. And so instead, I don't run into these people in the hallway, and I can't just shout over the cube wall.
Yeah.
And so I don't really have a lot of new information other than I know they're coming. I know vendors have been selected. I don't know where these areas, what areas these technologies will be rolled out at first. I would imagine that Tennyson is probably part of that conversation, but I'm not really sure. But I can certainly get you in contact with someone that can provide a lot more information than I can.
Yeah, Leslie, if you want, why don't you email, should she just email you through the operations email?
Yeah, that'd be great. And I can connect her with a couple of colleagues that have been working on that and know a lot more about it than I do.
Great. Yeah, I just heard that briefly on a call the other day, and I was really excited to hear that. So I don't have much more information either, but I'll look forward to that. Jill had a question about, is there any conversation about turning side streets, the really narrow ones particularly, into one way? I know on some of them there's no parking on one side. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's not, it's part of this conversation in some ways. There's a separate group, our transportation design group, can evaluate those requests, and so if there are specific blocks that you're interested in that you think are really challenging with parking being on one side of the street, certainly let us know. In the past, we have done some no parking. South Pearl Street, for example, there was a couple difficult streets that were a little more narrow than some other streets in the study area. And we put in some no parking zones strategically along that block so that if you had two opposing vehicles, one of them could pull into that no parking area and kind of get out of the way for the other vehicle. So we provided some more maneuvering space. And so that's a separate effort, but I can certainly connect you with colleagues that can address those more thoroughly than I can.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from our participants? I guess I can follow up and say, what's the next thing that we should hear out of this plan?
Yep, I was about to mention that. So great question. So what we'll be doing is addressing all the comments and questions that we receive for the next few weeks. And then we'll take all that feedback and I will summarize it, and we'll meet as a committee and say, committee, here's all the comments and questions we received. Here are a couple of additional 30-minute locations that were identified. Here's some disability parking that we need to add. There's a strong desire for time limits on this block, and we've conducted parking observations and we think they're warranted. So I'll just go over all the comments and questions and potential changes with them. And then what we'll do is mail that out as well to all addresses within the study area so that they have a draft of that. And then if necessary, can present at R&O meetings. And what I do with people that do have comments or questions, I just make sure to email them that information moving forward too. So if you email parking.operations, you have a question or comment about Stewart or Raleigh or what have you, I'll just add you to a list so that you receive email in the future and you receive updates about this plan moving forward.
Is there a landing page or web page?
There is, and there will be soon. The city is going a lot of their website, there's a big migration taking place. So changes are a little more slowly to happen. I think this information should be up by the early part of next week, is what I was told. And usually we put it up in advance, but given the migration and some other complications from a technology services perspective, some of that work has been delayed. And so, but it will be up soon.
Okay. And would that be the accessible, like what should people search for to find it eventually?
They could probably just Google. So we have our web address is parksmartdenver.com. And that'll take you to just the denver.gov site, but it's parksmartdenver.com. And then once you get on there, you should see a tab that says area management plans. And if you clicked on that, it would take you to the Tennyson page or the Baker page or Curtis Park or whatnot.
Awesome.
And we're hoping that that's still what it looks like. And that's what it should look like when it gets posted next week.
Okay, fantastic. We'll send out those updates in our newsletter as well. And in
Okay.
the meantime, I know that Berkeley Regis United Neighbors, Brun, posted a copy of the draft concept that you have up here. That's on their website. And I'm going to put a direct link to that in our chat here. You can also, if you Google Tennyson Curbside Access Plan, it's one of the first things that show up. So in case you don't have that, you can review it here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, we've almost gone an hour, and if anyone else has any last questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, I think we might close here. Thank you so much for your time and for coming to talk to the community about this and collecting comments and feedback. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, and like I said, if anybody has any comments or questions that come to mind in the next couple of weeks, feel free to send them to that parking.operations email address, and then you'll hear more from us in the future.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And hope everybody has a great rest of your Friday and a fantastic weekend.
Yep, sounds great. You too.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Bye.